begin the day by asking a question. And the question is this: how many of you have ever had something happen to you, a situation or an occurrence of some sort, something that was beyond your control, something that was not caused by you, it was not something based on choices you made, it was simply a situation that you had to face in life that was unpleasant, painful, or grievous? How many people here have ever had that experience? How many have never had that experience? How many people didn't raise their hands? I think a lot of times we as human beings, we want to reduce things down to really easy answers. We want to reduce them down to really simple, simplistic sort of ways of viewing things. And that's not a bad desire, but the reality is, with our limited minds and our limited experience, chances are we will not be aware of all of the complexities of life, all of the ingredients that go into different situations, what makes different people tick, why people act the way they act, and why certain situations take place. It's very difficult for us to understand all of the pieces that go in. And we should attempt as much as we can to understand as much as we can. But even with that, there are going to be aspects and elements and ingredients that we probably will not be able to totally see and understand. And so I believe that Scripture is a study in the balance between all of the complex factors converging in God's created order. You know, when you look at Scripture, God's giving us just a little bit of an insight into the things that we probably otherwise would not know. You know, just think of a passage like Genesis 1. God gives us information in Genesis 1 that if He had not given us that information, chances are we would not understand what is said in Genesis 1 the way it's said. That is information that God had to give to us. The details we probably would have never, and we still argue over it, don't we? We still have people trying to set forth one position or another position based on that information. So a lot of life is unexplainable. A lot of the complexities of life, a lot of the ingredients, a lot of the factors that make up life, we probably will never completely understand or comprehend. And a lot of things, consequently, are things that we have no direct control over. However, there are certain things in life, there are certain dimensions to your life as a human being, to my life as a human being, that I can control. In fact, there are elements to our lives, especially as individuals, that you must control. There are things that you have no direct control over, but there are certain things that you do have direct control over. And a lot of times I find that we spend a lot of time possibly complaining about things that other people do that are out of our control, and at the same time neglect exercising control over the things we can control. So today what I want to focus on, what I want to think about, is the idea that a significant part of the task that we have been given as human beings by our Creator is to govern. I believe that when we say something like that, that's a relatively simple statement. But when you start thinking about the fact that we have been given the responsibility, the abilities and responsibility to engage in a task of governing, and you start thinking about what that reaches, what aspects of life that pertains to, it's kind of this unending string of thoughts. That as human beings, you think about the opening statement in Genesis when God created man. Let us create man in our image. In the image of God, let us create man. Male and female, let us create them. And then what does he say? What's the next thing he says in reference to human beings? Let them rule. Another way of saying that is, let them govern. Govern what? Well, in the passage, he says, the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the creeping things. And then it's like, oh, what the heck? Over all the earth. Why name every little thing? Man has been given the task, the responsibility to govern over what? God's creation. And you begin to think about that. Brian, you have cattle, right? Okay. One of the things that Brian has to do with cattle, and maybe you've never thought about it this way as a farmer, but you govern cattle. You also govern pigs. I won't take it any further than that. Right? But you understand, even in the realm of planting crops, what you're doing is you're governing. Now, so there's all sorts of things that we are responsible for governing. Mike governs rocks. Inanimate objects, but they need to be governed. Brian is governing animate objects, but they're not moral animate objects. Right? And God said, let us rule over them. Let us govern them. That's our task. He gave us all the plants and the seeds from the plant for food. But what do we have to do in order to effectively and consistently produce food? We have to govern. So, and he says over every living thing. Now here's something we probably have never directly connected with that statement. How many human beings would fit under the category of living things? Right? So what else are we supposed to govern? We're supposed to govern in the affairs of human beings. Now it's different governing a rock than it is governing a pig, than it is governing a person. But it all needs to be governed. And if we are going to govern effectively, we need to govern together with the great governor of the kingdom. Human beings get in trouble when we attempt to govern apart from God. So we are to be workers together with God. God is actively exercising certain areas of government. God is governing in the affairs of history and nations on some level. But God has also created us in His image, and He has invited us to be part of that governing process. That if we look at the fact that all that we do day after day has some level and element and dimension of governing to it, that helps us have, I think, a proper focus. You know, when a human being enters into different roles, when a man becomes a father or a woman becomes a mother, their realm of government has just shifted. Before you were a father, you did not have to govern these young human beings who were formulating their character and their mind and their concepts and their ideas of life. But once you become a father or a mother, you now have a responsibility to govern in another realm that you weren't responsible for before. And I think sometimes we just we take all of this stuff for granted. And if you're going to understand what kind of father or what kind of mother or what kind of husband or what kind of wife you should be, the best place to get your basic information is from the Phil Donahue Show. Oprah Winfrey. I can't even say that name. Dr. Phil. I mean, there are 1,001 voices out there telling us how we should govern. But where we should get our basic information, the basic principles of understanding how to govern, come from God. So what I want to do is I want to focus on 3 areas of government, 3 fundamental, 3 foundational areas of government that if you do not get these 3 right, chances are you're in for a lot of turmoil and a lot of confusion in life. Those 3 areas are this, and I'll talk about each one separately: the heart, your mind, and your choices. Your heart, your mind, and your choices. Each of you as individuals. When we talk about the heart, it is impossible for me to govern your heart. When it comes to the human heart, and I'll define what that is here shortly, but you are ultimately the one who is in charge of governing your heart. Other people can exercise an influence on you, but the bottom line is, you choose, you decide the condition and the state of your heart. And I find that for most people, through the course of life, we tend to build barriers around our heart. Now, they are either good ones or bad ones. But for most people, we suppress and we bury the essence of our heart deep within ourselves as a protective measure. Now, I think our culture, and probably if you just sort of pick up ideas as you grow and as you go through life, most people would probably assume that when you use the word heart, you're talking about the emotions. You know, that touched my heart. You know, when people say that, they're usually talking about an emotional sort of experience. But in Scripture, the essential use of the word heart is not about the emotions. Your emotional system is something completely different. Your heart is something very specific, and it is the most fundamental thing that you have to govern. And if you don't get the heart right, you're laying a foundation upon which nothing else will fit together properly. So what is the heart? Your heart is what you are committed to supremely. It is the actual goal or the actual purpose you have in life. You know, Jesus said some interesting things like these people, they honor me with their mouth, their lips. In other words, they call me Lord. They say I love you. They say I'm a follower of Jesus. They say I believe in Jesus. But then what's he say? But their heart is far from me. So what is he saying? He's saying the reality is, regardless of all of their religious activities, regardless of all of the verbiage they use, regardless of certain external areas of life that they govern, when I examine what they're committed to supremely, something else has their heart. Something else is supreme to them. Something else is more important, more appealing to them than loving me, honoring me, following me, knowing me. They might have a little place in their life for me, one little cubicle, but I'm just one item in a series of cubicles, but not the supreme item. Your heart is what you consciously, willfully resolve to go after supremely. It is your ultimate goal in life. It is the bottom line. It is the purpose for which you live, is your heart. And Jesus said it this way: where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Whatever you see as most valuable is your heart. It's not about being religious. In fact, if you're a religious person and Christ does not have your heart is not ultimately committed to Christ, then all of your religion is vanity. What you could effectively consider a person who engages in religious activity without having Christ as the ultimate goal and purpose and focus of their heart is a Pharisee. The idea of being religious without having Christ as your ultimate goal would be that you engage in religious activity for some other reason, some other purpose. So the first thing we need to govern is our heart. Every human being has a goal or a purpose that prevails above everything else. Every human being does. Some people might not understand what that is, but I guarantee you have something that ultimately drives and motivates you, that is the supreme motivating factor in your life. Every human being does. Everybody has an overarching target at which they are aiming, through which they evaluate everything else that takes place. When they address life, when they try to figure out what they're going to do and why they're going to do it, everybody has a lens through which they look that brings focus to life. Every human being does. And I would say that you either consciously, intelligently establish it and choose it, or by default, for most people, through your impulses and your emotional responses, you will arrive at some ultimate goal in life. And I believe a lot of people simply allow their impulses to determine what they're going to be committed to. This is where it's dangerous getting your feelings mixed up with your heart. Because your heart is a conscious decision. It is identifying what is most valuable. And if you simply go by your emotions, all of a sudden you're attaching yourself to something that makes you feel good. Now, with the guys I deal with in prison, somewhere in that mix, drugs or alcohol, or I've actually had one guy tell me that he loves the thrill of crime. He's a thrill seeker. And so thrills set the stage for what he does and why he does it. He's not looking at whether it grieves God or honors God. He's not looking at whether he loves his neighbor or doesn't love his neighbor. He's looking at what he can do to satisfy this urge within himself to experience the next thrill. And some people chase after money. Some people chase after sex. Some people chase after fame. Some people chase after... But everybody has an ultimate that sets the stage, and that ultimate is your heart. And when you boil all this down, when it comes to the area of the heart, when you work through it all, you come down to the fact that there are really only two ultimate choices that human beings can make. You're either ultimately committed to serving yourself on some level, in some measure, through some avenue, some way. It might even be through religion. That's why it's That's why you need to pay very close attention to preachers who preach motivational messages about what God will do for you. Because that message, if it hasn't already crossed the line, is very close to crossing the line that Christianity is all about you getting what you want. And you just so happen to use God to get it. But it's not about loving God supremely. It's not about serving God. It's not about honoring God. It's not about knowing God. It's about using God. And a message like that, under the guise of, under a thin veneer of Christian lingo, is very dangerous. Because we can turn religion, we can turn Christianity, we can turn biblical principles into tools that ultimately serve me. And I think that is probably one of the greatest dangers that we face in the realm of religion. So two types of people on planet Earth are either those whose ultimate goal is serving themselves, pleasing themselves, honoring themselves in one way or another. The other category is people who have resolved that their ultimate goal and their ultimate purpose in life is to know God, to love God, to honor God, to please God, to serve God. There are very few human beings who fit into that category, relatively speaking. Even in the religious community, I think that at times people have not really examined or evaluated or taken inventory of their heart to the place where they actually understand what their ultimate purpose is. So consequently, we can look at a passage like what Jesus said. He said, the path that leads to life is what? It's narrow. And few there are who find it. What about the path that leads to death? It's wide, and many are those who walk upon it. Why? So the first thing we need to govern is our heart. Proverbs 4, proverbial statement, very insightful, says this: watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it come the springs of life. Jesus said, the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart. And those defile the man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander, and you could go on and on and on. So the heart becomes the foundation. Now, what is the first thing after establishing your heart and giving attention to governing in that affair, in that aspect of life? What is the next thing you need to govern? I would suggest it is your mind. And it is very important to govern your mind. A human being, especially a Christian, especially an individual who wants to know God, should never be done giving attention to governing your mind, to applying your mind in study. You know, I think some people just go through life that whatever sticks, sticks. But I'm not going to apply myself. I'm not going to open up a book and read a paragraph that I don't understand and read it and read it and read it until I do understand it. I'm not going to expose myself to further information or truth or understanding. If I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. We live in a nation that is becoming increasingly uninformed. There are certain people out there who specialize in manipulating ignorant people. And I think our country is taking on shape because they are doing a good job. But who should have the information, the truth that the world actually needs? It is us. But if we don't apply ourselves to being able to provide that insight, that information, you know, it's easy to just sort of have the assumption that somebody else is in charge of that. We should all, on some level, be applying ourselves to increasing our understanding of truth in any realm. Historical truth, philosophical truth, biblical truth. Wherever it is true, whatever is true, it belongs to God. You know, people are rewriting history, and they're selling it to the kids in our schools. And most people just sit back and let it take place because either I don't know or it doesn't really affect me. But we need to govern our minds. Now, here's the thing about governing your mind. It's directly connected to your heart. If your heart is selfish and evil and wicked, how are you going to govern your mind? You're going to think about, you're going to devise things that are consistent with your heart. But if your heart is committed to God, then it should show by the fact that you govern your mind, by the fact that you continue, as Paul says in Romans 2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What does it mean to have a renewed mind? Is that just a once and done thing? No, we renew our mind moment by moment, day by day, as we actually use it to think. Think about the incredible thing the mind is. God created the mind. He patterned it after His own mind. You have the ability to use memory. What if you didn't have memory? You have the ability to use your imagination, to be creative. These are all mental activities. You have the ability to take information and to evaluate it and to analyze it and to work with it and to draw conclusions. In fact, the word in Scripture for understand is a word which it would almost be like if you had 2 drops of water and those 2 drops of water got closer and closer and eventually they touch. What's going to happen to them? Those 2 drops now become one bigger drop. And the word understand in the Greek is that kind of word. It's where this bit of information and this bit of information, through a process of thinking and reasoning and evaluating, all of a sudden, boom! And that's God's design for the human mind. To grow in knowledge, to grow in understanding, to grow in wisdom. Jesus, as a 12-year-old, was blowing people away, but it says after that, and He continued to increase in wisdom. So the next thing we have to govern is our mind. We have to attempt to understand things. Really apply your mind. Now, I'm going to wrap it up, because the final thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'm just going to cut it short, is this idea that in conjunction with what you're committed to supremely, and in conjunction with the degree of understanding you have, you are then responsible to govern your choices. And I cannot emphasize to you strongly enough how important choices are. Bad choices can produce a whirlwind of craziness, chaos. Good choices, on the other hand, can sort of bring things together in the midst of chaos. If a person has not resolved to govern their heart, if a person has not resolved to surrender their heart to God, then the only thing other people will ever do in reference to govern is attempt to govern their external behavior. And that's all you can do. And so you're constantly telling them what to do, when to do it, how to do it, why to do it, or trying to prevent them from doing stupid stuff. It's not until a person's heart is filled with the love of God that they then on their own begin to govern their own lives to that end. And the degree of external government begins to shrink. But what's God want us to do? Love Him with all your heart. Love Him with all your mind. Love Him with all your soul and all of your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. You know, if that became a reality in the human race, think how drastically life on planet Earth would change.